we're really going to take a lot of your questions, and I'm going to have a little bit of a conversation up here with this lovely person sitting next to me. But the things that didn't come up, we're going to free fall this. We already were sitting up here talking 10 minutes, and we're like, we should have had the mics on. So let me introduce this lovely human sitting next to me. And again, we're framed this through the Optimist telescope because she has a book. And this isn't meant to be Pollyannish, right? This is meant to be quite serious because we do need to think about what the future holds and how we position ourselves for the future. So in this final conversation, I'm joined by someone who has been thinking about this her entire career. Bina Venkataraman, she is a journalist, author, and policy expert whose work has spanned the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the White House, the Broad Institute at Harvard, and MIT. She has this amazing book, which I recommend, The Optimist Telescope, Thinking Ahead in a Reckless Age, which came out a few years ago, 2019. So she probably needs to write an update to it. She was named a top business book. This book was named top business book by the Financial Times, best book of the year by NPR. She serves as the Washington Post's inaugural columnist of the future, a role that's very, very fitting. And her work is all about how we learn to think beyond the immediate crisis, to imagine what's possible, and to make decisions today that honor the people and the communities who will come after us. So Bina, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here. And it's always fun to be the last person standing between an audience and food and drink. So thank you for everyone for being here and for the just exceptionally interesting conversations and panels we've already had.
Yeah. And you guys didn't hear us open these. These are water. I know they look like beer, but they are water.
We thought about beer. We did.
So what inspired you to even take on this project and to write this book to begin with?
So, I'll say a little bit about what inspired it, but it really broadened and opened up in the process of researching and writing it. So, the book came out of my work in science and tech policy. So, most recently, I have been a journalist, both a writer of a column and a leader at the Washington Post until several months ago, and before that, the Boston Globe. But I spent about a decade before returning to journalism and in science and tech policy, including working on climate change in the Obama administration, and where I got the privilege of being Kristan Dorgalow's colleague. There's Kristan. And in the process of working on climate science and trying to open it up to more communities and citizens and private sector businesses to use the information we knew about the changing climate even then, which, the increased threats of wildfires, floods, droughts, all these things that we've seen manifest much more in the years since that. I would find that it wasn't just about the politicization of climate science or the controversies that had been manufactured and some real dilemmas and debates, but even among well-meaning people who actually wanted to look at the climate science and make decisions based on that science about their lives, about their communities, about if they were a mayor, about the city they were leading, if they were a Fortune 500 CEO, about the company they were leading. Even with good intentions, these leaders often felt hamstrung in thinking about the future and planning for a future with climate change. So they couldn't actually do the thing of being adaptive to climate change or resilient to climate change because they were struggling with that. And, when I left government, I went back to Boston where I was teaching at MIT and based at the Broad Institute. And I was sort of like just kind of, I don't know, I became obsessed, I guess, with this question of why is it so hard for people to think long term? Why is it so hard for us to act on behalf of the future? And there's some pretty pat answers to that question, like, oh, we're just like the hunter gatherers on the plain, and we can only think about, the food right in front of us. And so, how could we possibly do something like plan for a complex problem in the future? But the more you think about that and interrogate that question and look at that assumption, you find counterexamples everywhere of where people have actually thought about the future, acted on behalf of their own futures, whether it's something like you studied another language for a really long time and it didn't become useful to you till a decade later or 5 years later, or as complex as the agricultural revolution, where people decided to sow seeds for later harvest and put resources to the effect of the future, or to build cathedrals that stood for centuries and generations, or to really think on behalf of future generations, as many scientists are doing today in their practice and knowledge. So that was really the question, was is the curiosity. I don't know if Scott is still here, about what conditions and what practices allow us to think ahead and think about the future and plan for the future strategically, and to go about answering that question by talking to all kinds of different people. I went all over the world. I talked to people in investment firms, on farms, in fishing communities. I was in Japan, I was in Mexico, I was in Kansas, I was in virtual reality labs, and I was in places where people are using very ancient techniques to kind of disassemble and reassemble shrines. So it was wide ranging, and it consulted a lot of fields of science, a lot of hard sciences, but also the research took me a lot into the areas of behavioral science and research because of, in part, my background as a science journalist. Um, I've been raised by scientists, which is like being raised by wolves. And so I kind of had this whole thing where when I was a kid, I was always translating for my parents because they were both immigrants and scientists. And I was always trying to like be the glue between them and other people and helping connect um, what was happening in my small town in Ohio with my parents and their kind of rarefied knowledge and ways. And but I always felt that deficit model that Tony talked about this morning had its limitations, and that you could tell people the science of something changing, the science of something in the future, but to actually get them to do something would be a different challenge. So that took me into a lot of the research around why people ignore things like hurricane forecasts when they ignore them, or why they acknowledge them when they do acknowledge them and make plans. Um, so I can say a lot more, but that was the journey of how I got there. Yeah.
You had a lot of amazing good stories that really grounded that in the book. Is there one that kind of resonated with you that you want to share about? You just mentioned the conditions that allowed for that future thinking. I would love if you wanted to pick one out or something that isn't in this book and share an example of that with the audience.
Sure. So before I say that, I just wanted to say something about the conversations that happened earlier because, um, as I said, it was the project of trying to understand how we think long term for me was motivated by climate science and wanting to do right by future generations, wanting myself to be a better ancestor, and this will come to the answer to your question. But um, the the reality is that the moment we're in right now, all of this uncertainty and volatility that folks talked about, that Kristen and Dan talked about earlier, that resonated again with Lisa and Massimo's comments. Uh, those are the times when it's actually really hardest to think long term, right? Times like the ones we're living in right now. And this is also the time, and you heard this resonant all day today, where we need to imagine the future and build for a future more than ever, right? We heard about the need to earn more trust between communities and scientists. We need to fundamentally rethink the way we do things so that we can actually unleash more innovation, more public benefits of science that benefit more people. And so it's this weird paradox. We're in this like kind of bind where we are trying to think long term and be bold for the future, but all the things that are coming at us and all of the near term headwinds are encouraging us to think more short term. So that brings me to one of the examples that I love to talk about in the book, which is I spent some time with people who are infectious disease researchers in emergency rooms, that work in emergency rooms or with emergency room physicians in hospitals, including an amazing physician named Sarah Cosgrove at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And um, she was trying to get at the question of why are so many antibiotics being prescribed to people in the hospital in situations where they shouldn't be prescribed. And of course, this was giving rise to antibiotic resistance and to what we now know as superbugs. At the time I was writing the book, COVID hadn't happened yet. So really I was thinking like, okay, we have to be thinking about this almost as the next pandemic, these superbugs that arise because people take too many antibiotics. And so she was looking at why it is that people overprescribe or prescribe when they haven't diagnosed that there's an actual bacteria that should be treated by this particular drug. And found, right, that so much of that was related to scarcity, right? So the doctors going from place to place in like a system of rapid triage, very little time with each patient to spend time. And then the demands, right? The patient begging them for some sort of cure. And they're just like, okay, we got to just write a prescription. And so, really high pressure circumstances where you have a lot of um, pressure to do the instant gratification thing, which is prescribe. And then she and her colleagues and other colleagues in other places in the world were looking at like what are the interventions that actually work to get people to take that extra step to actually think about the consequences and to actually be able to imagine like what else could they do in this moment in front of this patient. And so they did some very kind of almost like if you know the nudge concept from Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, they did some sort of behavioral science interventions that would get just take that extra step, like when you're putting in an order for a prescription for an antibiotic as a doctor in their emergency room, you'd have a extra step that would ask you to rationalize it, like make an explanation. So it couldn't just happen quickly. So just creating some friction in the process, but also changing norms. So, and this is an example that recurred in a lot of the different cases I looked at of where leaders were actually able to change culture and help people think ahead, even amid scarcity of resources, scarcity of attention, and intense pressures to think short term. And so, if you change the norms, like in the UK, a bunch of physicians were sent regular, almost report cards, but they were told kind of this happens in a lot of energy contexts today, but they were told basically what their record was of prescribing antibiotics when it was appropriate versus not. And they were tracking it in the system. And it wasn't like a punitive thing. It was just like, here's how your peers are doing, and here's how you are. And they found tremendous results from just changing that basic thing of this is a cultural norm, and we're going to compare you to your peers. And it's a prestige industry where people pay attention to that. So that's just one example. Yeah.
Half thought question here. Bear with me. So what I'm hearing from this story and what I often see, right, is as a society, we don't like uncertainty. We want certainty, right? Doctors are doing that because their patients want something to do. They want an answer. They want to feel healthy. They want to be told, I can help fix you, right? So we have these sort of individual, as all of us humans, actions and behaviors that we have to navigate. And then we have, which equate to often social norms at like the individual level, but then you have social norms across, institutions and fields of expertise. And that to me is a really interesting sort of thing about you have social challenges as a society, and that is the role for policies. It's the role for potential expertise and intervention into a larger system when you're trying to think out about the future that is very uncertain. So that's my frame. There's not a question here. I'm getting there. But yeah, I would love for you to think about that difference of a lot of us think that there's this really strong role here for this individual because we do want individuals to have a voice and to have a say and to have autonomy and things like that. But at times we know that that is really hard to plan for the future if you're waiting to get the tens of millions of hundreds of millions of people on board with any sort of future state that you're trying to plan for. So how should we be thinking about that through our systems of planning for the future, and where are some right interventions? That was a long,
Yeah,
sorry.
no, I mean, I do think the collective nature of this is so important. Like, and hopefully that comes as some relief, right? I think the idea of being able to think long term, if you're struggling with your own sense of pressures in the moment or scarcity in the moment, suddenly, if you're asked to think about having a bold vision for the future of American science, for example, just one thing, right? That's a space you're inviting people into that requires a lot of them. And so it can really help. And I hope we'll get to talk about imagination because that's a really important part of this and a really important remedy to the despair that we feel in our current times. But um, at the very kind of organizational, tactical, practical level, a lot of the examples that I unearthed of sort of failures to think long term, let's say, have to do with decisions organizations and systems and institutions make around what they measure. So metrics. Someone brought up earlier the publish, like the mandate to publish or perish, right? And publishing on the margins, not to say that each of the publications any of you have produced have not been important, but when you're encouraged to constantly publish on the margins of knowledge, where is the bandwidth? Where is the space to be imagining a different future, to be thinking at, to be leaning at really long-term problems of basic discovery and curiosity? Um, there are leaders and there are institutions that have done things like try to kind of reconstruct their tenure uh, systems, reward systems to incentivize collaboration, to incentivize public benefits, right? They're rare exceptions. I think ASU is one of them. There are probably others that folks could mention. But these are things where if Punch was still here, I would ask him, how in his time at NSF, or is there a horizon for scientific funding agencies to be thinking about the incentives, the reporting incentives, and the nature of short-term results versus long-term breakthroughs, and how the funding structures and what is measured in those, the institutions that then follow those incentives either can reinforce short-term results or long-term results. But I also want to say that I really appreciate this is not sort of like I'm not trying to make a case that long-term thinking is always the most important thing, right? There are exceptions to that, and there are real needs to produce real results in the short term as well. And so it's like, how do you have a system that acknowledges, almost like a portfolio would if you were an investor, right? That there is a need for short-term returns, that we have to think about what our short-term benefits are to society, communicate the benefits. I think this point was made so well in the last session, that there are real benefits that have already been accrued by science, right? That required patience in the past, or that were open ended. And people didn't know that GPS was going to become such a critical technology that all of us would be carrying around, right? A link to GPS satellites in our pockets, right? And so, how do we tell the stories that link us back to the need for patience? Having a long historical memory can help us see why short-term metrics are not always the most meaningful metrics. But organizations and leaders actually have to set a culture. It's like the cultural norms matter, and what they measure matters.
What are some other long-term metrics that are important to be thinking about, or examples you could provide?
Yes. So I did mention that I left the Washington Post months ago. And of course, if you were reading the news yesterday, there was more catastrophic news about the management of that organization. So I don't bring up this example because I am a big fan of the person I'm about to mention. But in the early days of Amazon, if you look at what that company was doing, it was quite counter to what a lot of the dot-com companies of the same era were doing. This is 25 years ago or more. And the idea was that Jeff Bezos wrote a letter to his shareholders basically saying, we are not going to turn high quarterly profits. That metric is not meaningful to the company that is being built here. And so instead, he offered some counter metrics. And the metrics that he offered were things like, watch if our share of the market of certain retail categories is growing. So look at if that share, that's a metric. Look if we're building loyalty, like if people are coming back and using this product over and over again. And that's the basis on which he built a company that was successful very long term. I wish that was being applied right now in the news industry dearly. But the point is that there are metrics that are about demonstrating, that are about like satisfying the patient who's begging for something. They're about demonstrating that you're doing something, and it can often be in a superficial way. Or it might not be superficial, right? If you're handing profits to your shareholders on a quarterly basis, that's not entirely meaningless. But you could be doing that, and it could be completely obfuscating that you're gutting your organization of any investment in innovation or research and development, that you're gutting your investment in talent. You're not building a pipeline to talent of the future. You're not adapting to how technology is changing the world. All of that could be masked by doing really well in the short term. And so the kind of metric people should be looking for are what I would call milestones instead of these dashboard, sort of, I call them dashboard driving metrics, right? So how fast you're going right now is not as relevant as whether you're hitting milestones on the way to your theory of what is going to be successful. So it comes with having an identified theory of what is the innovation or success. And if that changes, that's okay. And then your milestone metric can change. But along the way, uh, whatever you're measuring should reflect what your ultimate goal is. And so that's such a simple concept that when I say it, I feel like I'm telling people something that, is so obvious. It's like, but it's so amazing how many organizations do not pick metrics that are milestones. It's much more common that they do not pick metrics that are milestones. And that has to do with human psychology. It has to do with lots of things, including greed and I would say in the corporate sector and fast turnover and investment. It's bled into sectors that are not really about short-term profit. If you ask people, what is the scientific enterprise about?
Yeah, long term.
Yeah, it's about generating long-term knowledge. It's about training talent. It's about treating, as I would say in this framework of being a good ancestor, treating scientific knowledge like an heirloom that we are handing to the future.
That's beautiful. I love that. It makes me, there is this, we're sticking with this medical theme here, this idea of can you create some sort of short-term metric? In my head went to, we need to take the idea of the placebo effect, right? And try to apply that into some sort of near-term benefit, that whether or not is it a massive change, right? I think I'm very susceptible to the placebo effect. So if you can create a near-term metric that's a placebo effect for me, then that drives behavior and change, and then you can still focus on those long-term
I
ones.
know there are a lot of people who do this, actually.
Okay,
No, I
yeah.
called it glitter bombs in the book because when I had a friend who was running a marathon and he loves glitter, and I would meet him at different mile markers and throw glitter on him to keep him going. But this is a very serious thing, actually. So Wes Anderson, who is a farmer scientist who founded the Land Institute, if folks know it, just a state over in Kansas, I spent some time learning about the technology he was developing at the farm. I kind of, not using AI, but very much, maybe now they are actually at the Land Institute. I should check in on them. But um, breeding perennial grains. So the idea is to breed grains that aren't like our current annual grains of wheat and corn and so on and so forth that strip the topsoil of our farms, and then there's runoff and you have massive erosion, and every year, by the way, that has a big impact on the climate, but every year you're forced to be more resource intense to replenish the fertile soil and replant your farm. And so his thinking was we need deeper rooted grains in order to get farming to a place where it can be more sustainable for the planet and for the lands and the landscape. But in breeding the perennial grains, he wasn't like trying to convince farmers to go and grow these perennials that were going to have very bad crop yields in the short run, because you're not going to convince any farmer to grow them, right? So the whole idea of crossbreeding them, he ended up crossbreeding these ancient prairie perennials with modern monoculture crops to develop grains that could have deep roots to anchor the topsoil, but also have high yields. So you need like sometimes whether it's a placebo or real, sometimes you need real things in the short run that kind of help subsidize or help you get along the way to your long-term goal, but being careful not to confuse them for each other.
Okay, we're going to take about 15 more minutes here. Please, if you got any lingering questions throughout the day you want us to ramble about, that's our goal here. But I want to take a moment. She mentioned this, and we were talking about this last night. I think for those of you who didn't see about the Washington Post, there was a significant number of layoffs. We know you had a role there. We know you still have colleagues and connections and partners, still involved in this. But the thing that we were talking about last night that I want you to perhaps reflect on was we are experiencing lots of shifts. Again, I mentioned this earlier. There's intentional shifts, there's market shifts, there's things happening. We're changing. Our information ecosystem is changing. Our news media landscape is changing. Funding's changing. Our priorities as a nation. And what that often requires when you're going through change is what I think is really brave leadership, right? To think through the critical decisions you need to make to position your organization or your team or your community for the future. And sometimes those decisions are very hard and they have really ruptured effects. I would be curious your thoughts on whether it could be in the news world and the journalism world, which you are, and seeing lots of change, or others, where you've seen opportunities or people experiencing some of that brave leadership, and where do we need to see more of that?
Oh, that's such a great question. I've been seeing people use this hashtag recently, courage is contagious, for when they see, right, an institution or a leader doing the like perceived right thing for the long run, not just playing to short-term transactional benefit to themselves or to their organization. And it can be tricky because leaders are often stuck in these places of do you put a target on your back, to use Kristen's formulation from earlier, and maybe sacrifice resources in the short run? What is that going to mean in order to stand for your values and principles? And I don't think there's not a single answer to that out of context, because the context does matter. What is the mission of your organization? What are the values of your organization? Who are you taking care of, and how are you taking care of them? And how do you continue your work, but also continue to make your work meaningful? And I think um, the reason I left the Washington Post before this happened, what happened yesterday happened, is that I felt there was neither a business nor an editorial strategy for the long term that was innovative and credible. So I didn't think that there was a long-term strategy. I looked under a lot of hoods. I was a leader there. And so making that was not an easy decision. But I also didn't make it a huge public statement at the time, in part because there remained and still remain a lot of really good journalists working there. And there's an interesting lack of agency we have right now to do much about the threats to truth and knowledge and community that many people feel at the moment. And so people were mass canceling, right, their subscriptions, in part because of what Vanessa pointed out, that people don't know the distinction between opinions and news. And our industry has done a not very good job of explaining and delineating between opinion and news. And there were a series of decisions made, an endorsement of Kamala Harris that was held in the opinion section of the paper, but really affected the reputation of the whole brand and the whole paper. So I'm saying this to this is all like kind of a wind up to say, um, I think that there are acts of courage happening all over the place. I think some of them, for example, I met someone who works at the Department of Labor recently, and he had basically figured out a way to turn a directive from the current White House into something that he felt could preserve the knowledge base and staff of the Department of Labor. And he's not talking about it publicly because to talk about it publicly would make it impossible to keep doing. So I think we're in a little bit of a dilemma that there are a lot of courageous people doing courageous things. Not all of them carry the bravado of entering the arena. Some of them are just about quietly shepherding the work that you need to do and defending the boundaries of that work. And others are going to have to do things like affirm values and stand up and say, we will not be held hostage to the Trump administration's threat around science funding. We will not undermine our values around other things that make our campus safe, and we will say no to that. And I know that's a political thing for me to have said, and we are, I think, in a nonpartisan atmosphere. But I do also think that, to the earlier points made earlier, when you have a set of values around campus culture, educating the next generation, all of these things, right? You don't want to throw that out. It's not just about, right? Scientific research is one objective of many universities, but it's not the only objective.
Yeah, absolutely. You brought this word up a little bit earlier, and I remember I'd written this down from your book that you had wrote that prediction is not that helpful for heeding future threats unless it's paired with imagination. So how might we use imagination to help us think about the future, perhaps the future of science?
Yes, I love this because, sometimes I don't necessarily go around telling people I'm an optimist, but because I have a book with this in the title, people will say, like, how are you an optimist right now? And even I have friends who will text me and they'll be like, what's your cause for hope and optimism? They'll just text me like on a random day when like something went down in Minneapolis. And I'm often like, I don't know. I mean, am I an optimist still? No, but I mean, or they want to know what I'm smoking. which I'm sure you can get in Colorado, whatever, right? Nice. I'm talking about nature. I'm talking about nature. I spend a lot of time in nature. That is my cause of solace and hope. But but so but the answer is imagination. So when the trend lines are look really bad, right? Especially as empirical people who like to look at data and evidence, right? When you look at trend lines like either a decline in funding for your area or take anything, right? The climbing average temperature um, of the atmosphere, uh, it can look really, really bad. And so it can feel stupid to have hope, right? It can feel like that's ignoring the trend. That's not following what what's reality, what the evidence is showing me to be hopeful in a time like this. And I think that is where the lesson of imagination, which I documented from people who have studied and participated and led social movements, but also from those who understand the behavioral science of why people ignore predictions and why predictions often fail. And um, this notion of the trust in the messenger that was brought up earlier matters a lot, but I want to bring the imagination part into it as well because part of it is what can you imagine happening to you? What could you imagine experiencing? And what do you believe is in the realm of possibilities? And this can go in different directions. One of the stories I tell in the book is about the Munich Olympics in 1972, where there was a police psychologist named Georg Sieber who was charged with creating scenarios of things that could go wrong at the Olympics, before the Olympics. And so there's some 26 scenarios. And one of the scenarios, situation 21, was a scenario he predicted where he predicted that terrorists would climb the fence at the Olympic Village and kidnap Israeli athletes and kill them or hold them hostage. And that's what ended up happening. And so they had this literally the scenario before the Olympics, the Olympic organizers had. And so the question might be like, well, why did they plan for that? They could have done some very simple things. They didn't have guards around the fences. They housed the athletes by nationality. He had recommended not housing them by nationality, but by sport or some other way. So they could have done things to avoid it. And the answer comes back to imagination and also comes back to the way that our biases affect us, the way that history affects us. So the organizers, this was the first time that the Olympics had been in Germany since 1936, which Hitler had presided over. And so they had this idea. They named the Olympics Die Heiteren Spiele, which means the cheerful, for those who know German, the cheerful games, carefree games. Um, and they didn't want the games to be seen as militaristic, so they didn't want security to have a heavy presence in Munich in the 70s. And so there's this kind of bias based on history. What are we trying to correct for? What's the image? So there was a sanitization of the scenario of the future that they were handed on a platter to prepare for, right? A scenario that did happen. So our imagination can be hamstrung either by things we think by thinking the world is better than it is, or by thinking the world is worse than it is. So the opposite, I think, is happening in a lot of places that I see now. People just assume we've been through so much that people are assuming the worst case scenario, which is an okay thing to do in terms of preparing for the worst case scenarios, but it doesn't help you much with taking the practical action that can bring about the better case scenarios, that can bring about a better future. And so I think one of the things we need to be working on now as collectives, as groups of people, whether that's your neighborhood, whether that's the organization where you work, whether it's your families, is trying to stoke people's capacity for imagining a better future. And one of the people I talked to in researching my book was a right hand to Cesar Chavez in the United Farm Workers Movement. And he talked about how the dreams that they had, the ideas that they had of the future were not vague ideas. They were very concrete ideas. Like, we want the farm workers' children to be able to go to school, right? It's like the famous I Have a Dream speech, of course, is another example of this, right? So very concrete and very shareable collective dreams, dreams that lots of people could get behind. The moonshot was a dream like that. It's a vision of the future that was a vision that lots of people could rally around, and people felt I think downright democratic, obviously in the context of the Cold War, so you have to say that it was pretty democratic. It was a response to Sputnik and all of that. but not just democratic in the sense that it was about showing that democracies could innovate and be as successful as the USSR, as a socialist republic, but democratic in the sense that, almost like all of the kids at that time would have loved to see someone walk on the moon, right? So, in that sense, I think we need to cultivate shared imaginations of a future, but it can't be like five people are going to go to Mars and everyone else is going to, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's capturing people's imagination as much as it should. And this speaks to some of the work that I think is really promising now around grand challenges and defining these moonshots in science, defining things that are worth doing that some of those ideas could happen in collaboration with communities. They don't have to happen from only elites and the top down, right? The idea of what those grand challenges should be, the idea of our next moonshots, don't need to just come from those with the expertise in the science to move them forward. I think they could come through conversations.
That was lovely. I'm actually curious. I've been sitting here as you were talking about these visions and these ideas that we could rally around about our future. And I couldn't come up with some strong ones right now. It could be my head. I could be tired. I definitely liked our Colorado panel here, but I'm not hearing as much as that, or it's not sticking with me. If there are these grand visions of a future out there that we're all moving together behind, it feels very reactive. It feels very headline driven. It feels very changing. Are there some that you've heard recently that are feel inspiring to you that you wanna share? And I'd be curious, folks here, you can share with me later.
Yeah, and I think this goes to the fact, I spend some time in the rare disease community because I have a niece with a rare disease, and I've tried to connect different dots of my work in science policy with some of that community and her specific community, organizations organized around her disease. But there's a lot of excitement right now about the potential. This is the potential of AI, but the potential of technology to help people better diagnose rare disease and better treat rare disease. And so the idea that all of these really isolate, right? There's more than 10,000 rare diseases, probably more we haven't identified, but that we could come somehow there could be a way to like take a huge leap forward that helps raise the level of all these boats that are unrelated to each other, right? These diseases are often not related to each other, but the fact that it can be unlocked first by being able to diagnose a lot more people. AI diagnosis is really fraught, as we all know, and generally with diagnosing common diseases, a physician is going to probably be better, is what I think right now. But when you get to the point of something that's a rare collection of symptoms, like being able to use a system that can scan all of the diagnoses and all of the constellations of systems that are out there, like that's a scale wise intervention. That's not quite a scenario of the future. But, I hear people in the context of certain political campaigns. You see science fiction writers. I see people imagining different kinds of neighborhoods, different kinds of societies, different kinds of ways where people help each other. um, and this does bring me to one study that I think is interesting that came from an Australian psychologist, where he looked at what got people motivated to engage with ideas of the future and take active steps to make the future better in their lives rather than just being focused on the short term. And he found that when people had scenarios of the future presented to them where he called it benevolence, but I would say it's like kindness. It's like a sense of a greater, like, social connection, right? That when people had those scenarios, they were much more likely to take actions. It was a study of only 600 people, but not nothing. And it was across different Western countries. And so I think the important thing there is it's almost more like a call to action to think about like what are the scenarios we can come up with that aren't just about what I gave you about example because I was like AI can solve rare disease, um but examples that might be like our neighborhoods of the future are going to look like our neighborhood, or just take one place where you live is going to look like this, and we hope it looks like this.
That was great. I'm gonna do a couple of these, and then we're gonna have some closing thoughts here. Um, I'm gonna start with this one, which is, how do you think about differentiating complicity and pragmatism, especially when strategizing about the best path through current challenges to achieve a long-term goal? This is what I like. How can you know you aren't becoming either complicit or a martyr?
such a great question. If I had a simple answer, I would tell you. I felt like I was grappling with this question last year very actively in my role, because I was in the leadership of the opinions team of the Washington Post, and I didn't want to throw my colleagues under the bus. I had the capacity to leave my role, and some of my colleagues chose to leave in a very public way that I do not fault them for, but also they, in doing so, drew a moral bright line that some of the other folks in the team maybe didn't have the liberty to do because of their financial circumstances. Maybe they had partners who had also lost their jobs because of Doge. DC has just been, this is a much more optimistic crowd today than the ones I've been hanging out with in DC. So, you know, I think it's like, I think it's a question, it's a very personal question of where your own moral boundaries are and what you feel is in integrity with yourself, because that is not a question another person can answer for you. It's only a question you can answer for yourself. And for me, I felt out of integrity, to the point that I made a decision to leave something rather than be complicit and pretend. I felt if I had stayed, I would have made. They would send me all over the world to do these talks, the Post at Davos and South by Southwest, and I was like a little bit of a poster child for the opinion section. And I felt if I kept doing that, that I would have made it seem like there are other decisions, editorial decisions that I felt were more about ingratiating the owner to power than about holding power to account, which is, I think, our mission. That I would be complicit in making those things seem better than they were, or less immoral than I believed them to be. Um, but I had the capacity. First of all, I helped negotiate a buyout for the team, so I got some months of severance for myself, and I had, I had savings. I had other resources. I do not have children, so I'm saying all this to tell you that um, I didn't take that step because I was like, everyone should take this step, and everyone should be a murderer, and everyone who stayed is complicit. I took it because I both had the capacity to take it and felt out of integrity with myself. So, um, it was the only way I had of answering that question, because I don't really know the circumstance that informed the question, if the person asking it is feeling complicit or feeling like becoming a martyr, or what the situation is. If we were in a live Q&A, I probably would have asked a couple more questions back, but
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Let me give you one final question here, which kind of was up on the screen and is a closing thought about. The question was related to parents, and younger generations, where there is a lot of negativity that exists in our media and in the world, and how you could inspire and give people what's that thing of hope? What's that one message of hope, whether it's to a parent to give to their next generation or whether it's to someone here in the room?
I mean, so the strategies and the message, I think, are to maybe connected, but the I think the strategy is, one, to look at history. There have been dark chapters in history, and there have been new things that have grown. And lately, the mental metaphor that has come to my mind, or the visual metaphor that has come to my mind, is of rhizomes. I'm luckily in a room of many science people, so I don't have to necessarily explain these underground root systems. And so when the earth is being scorched and everything looks like it's burning, there can still be underground systems that are prepared to grow what will thrive on the surface of the earth later. And that has been true even in the darkest chapters of history. And I think that that can be true today. And I also think it helps to bring them into play and imagination, right? And to make that joyful. The other lesson of these social movements was not just they had concrete imaginations and dreams of the future, but that they had joy along the way. Joy was their glitter bomb. Joy in being together and having shared experiences of imagining what could be, not just what was.
Join me in thanking Bina.